Who starts for the Denver Broncos at linebacker opposite of Josey Jewell? We take a look at Alex Singleton and Jonas Griffith in a premier competition matchup at Broncos Training Camp. Plus, who are some other linebacker names that you need to keep an eye on? Plus, any potential players the Broncos could target that are still available as free agents. You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Thursday. Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. From the South Stands to the End Zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst at Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Broncos country, thank you once again for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Available on all your favorite podcast providers and available to watch on YouTube in 4K high definition. We appreciate you so much. If you tune in every day and you haven't yet hit that subscribe or that follow button, do so now so you never miss a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sayre, our continuation of our training camp position previews carries on here this week. We've talked about wide receivers so far. We've talked about safety. We've talked about cornerback. Today, we focus on the linebackers, and the Broncos have an answer at the starting mic job with Josey Jewell returning, but that will linebacker spot is wide open as we get into training camp.
It is previously occupied by Alexander Johnson, of course, one of the two starters last year that went down with the pectoral injuries. Obviously, we lost both Josey Jewell and Alexander Johnson in 2021, and the Broncos prioritized bringing back Josey Jewell. And I remember even reading some stuff, George Paton kind of calling him basically like one of the heart and soul type of guys for that defense. Definitely a player that this front office really liked that was drafted by the previous regime. So Josey Jewell is back, but you're right. There's competition at that other spot. And it's going to be interesting because I can't recall a year in which the Denver Broncos carried so few off-ball linebackers, Cody, on the roster. I mean, it just feels like it's a very, very small group. Even adding a couple of undrafted players, you know, we got Jonas Griffith and Alex Singleton. We believe those are the two guys really competing for that other starting job at this point. And the Broncos must have a lot of confidence in both of those guys because behind them, it's pretty thin. But I think that's going to be a fun competition to watch. This is one of those positions on the roster right now. It's truly wide open going into training camp.
Well, and you mentioned as well with Alex Singleton coming over in free agency from the Philadelphia Eagles, not getting paid a lot to be on this Broncos team, by the way, but he had over 100 plus tackles last season, playing a key role on special teams, which where the Broncos need some boost there, but also playing and starting some games for that very tough Eagles defense last year that the Broncos had the opportunity to go against in person at Empower Field a Mile High. But then there's also Jonas Griffith on the other hand, who started the last 4 games for this Broncos team alongside Baron Browning. And his value, what we saw on the tape, what we saw on the field, it was very impressive for a guy who was really brought over via trade last offseason before the season began to just really boost special teams. And he didn't even really get a chance to be on the field when the Broncos had all these injuries at inside linebacker. But then somehow he finds his way into the rotation. And all of a sudden, he's turning heads. His speed, his athleticism, his ability to diagnose plays, and also his high level of production. We talk about 40 tackles in just 4 games in the back end of the season, getting his first start against a Cincinnati Bengals team that went to the Super Bowl, playing against the Kansas City Chiefs, who were in the deep playoff hunt, who lost to the Cincinnati Bengals en route to their Super Bowl appearance there. And then you just have a multitude of other games where he's just demonstrated that he can do it. And so far throughout OTAs, mandatory, the mini camp that the Broncos held on, man, I tell you what, he has looked the part, the ability to go sideline to sideline. One thing that's mentioned about him is his length. Like, he has tremendous length and wingspan to him. He is perfect against the run, and I feel like a great compliment to Josey Jewell, but he has competition with Alex Singleton. I mean, how do you think this matchup between these two guys will go?
Well, I think it's going to be really interesting just because of what you mentioned before. Alex Singleton has that time on task, right? He may not have been prioritized to come back to the Eagles this past offseason, and that's fine. That's not always the case for players that end up having success in other NFL cities. So I don't think we should necessarily write Alex Singleton off. I know we got one fan in the comments section they love Alex Singleton.
Harold.
I love that. Harold, he loves him some Alex Singleton. And you know what? I hadn't even thought about this, Cody, until we were preparing for this episode. But you want to know what's really interesting about the Alex Singleton pickup is a couple months before that pickup happened, Remember who the Broncos interviewed for their head coach was Jonathan Gannon, the defensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles. And what did they have to do in order to prepare for that interview? Well, they had to watch a lot of Philadelphia Eagles tape. And of course, everybody in Denver, they saw the Eagles up close and personal last year, saw them in person for that one game. But getting ready to interview Jonathan Gannon, the defensive coordinator of the Eagles, you get to see, hey, who's that guy out there that keeps, maybe this guy kept flashing off the tape. Maybe Alex Singleton was somebody that popped in their study before their interview of Jonathan Gannon. And I think that there's something to be said for that, right? Especially because of the lack of overall just quantity of players at this position. I think Alex Singleton is kind of fascinating from that perspective. And we know, he's been a special teams guy for his entire career. So it's a high floor situation there. You're giving yourself the opportunity to say, maybe this guy comes in and does a great job for our defense, plays really well in tandem next to Josey Jewell. At the very worst, at the very least, we're going to get somebody that can come in and be an upgrade on the special teams unit, which obviously over the last few years has been really, really poor in Denver.
I think it's safe to make the assumption we know who the top three linebackers are, off-ball linebackers for this Broncos team are. We just named them Josey, Jonas, and Alex Singleton. But really behind them, there's a lot of green guys who don't have a ton of NFL experience, guys who have limited experience on the field. There's Justin Sternad, who has high expectations for him. This is going to be a big year for him because practically the first year and a half, he never played it down for the Broncos, got thrown in the fire a little bit last year, had some highs, had some lows, has some areas he can improve. They also have Barrington Wade, and they have the undrafted rookie free agents Kadofi Wright and Kanai Maga as well, who've actually made some impressive plays throughout OTAs and mandatory minicamp. And it'll be up to them to continue that trend in preseason and in training camp in order to maybe uproot somebody. And that leads to us maybe projecting how many linebackers the Broncos may carry on the active roster here in 2022. But before we dive into that entire conversation, let me tell you about our good friends over there at Dave. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Now, Dave can help you get out of a pinch when you really need it the most. And hindsight is 2020, and you can't change the past. But what if you could get a little bit of help from your future self? Maybe you'd ask to borrow a little cash. Now you can with the Dave app here today. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, to buy a wedding gift, or to catch up on any bills that you may have. And you can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief that they need with extra cash. And so if you're in a pinch and you need some extra help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly today. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve. Member FDIC. Future you will thank you. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we're going to project the Broncos off-ball linebacker group. How many players do we think they'll carry onto the active roster heading into the season? We're going to get to that coming up here in just a moment. But real quick, wanted to take some time to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for taking time out of your day to listen to Lockdown Broncos, to make us your first listen of the day every single day. And if you're not doing so, here's why you need to. Because when you wake up in the morning, you have your morning cup of coffee, you're making breakfast, you're going on your morning jog, or you're going to work. You want the up-to-date latest information on this Denver Broncos football team. Lockdown Broncos is the place to be with an objective point of view, 30 minutes or less every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. Sayre, really looking at the widespread kind of conversation as to what we've been talking about here with projecting how we think the positions will play, how many players they carry on the active roster. We had cornerback listed with 6 players, safety at 5, receiver at 7. How many off-ball linebackers will the Broncos maybe carry on the active roster? We go through it, what it looks like right now. You have the Josey Jewells, the Jonas Griffiths, the Alex Singletons, the Kanai Maga. You also have Kadofi Wright. You have Justin Sternad, Barrington Wade. These players make up that room. But also I think the Broncos have to be a little bit cautious as to how they approach it, because 1 or 2 injuries to any of these guys can mean that they're in the same position that they were last year. And I think that's something that they want to avoid. Could we see the Broncos maybe look to add more? I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the show, but do you feel confident with the Broncos maybe carrying 4 total off-ball linebackers on the active roster this season, or do they think they need to carry a little bit more?
I think 4 is it may be like the over under, which sounds crazy because could you actually keep under 4? Like if we're talking about keeping 7 receivers, 11 defensive backs, and we'll kind of see what happens at these other position groups here. We've talked before, the Broncos have at least 10 NFL caliber offensive linemen. They have tons of tight ends. So there's going to be so much different stuff that plays into the factors in this roster construction and how things are built, and the practice squad rules that have changed, and how many guys you can keep, veterans that you can keep on the practice squad, and players that you can protect. These rules really help in terms of building your team and keeping as many good players as possible. So I think 4 is the over under at this point. And you mentioned Justin Cernat is probably that other guy. We've already talked about the competition between Jonas Griffith and Alex Singleton for that other position. We know Josey Jewell's making it. We know those two guys are making it. And right now it does feel like Justin Cernat has the edge over the other players, maybe because he's been around the longest, maybe because the Broncos kind of had the highest expectations, draft status, whatever you want to talk about there in terms of his advantages going into training camp. It does feel like Justin Cernat, if the Broncos keep 4, he kind of has that edge. But here's the thing that's playing in my head. You have Baron Browning, who we'll talk about when we go through the edge players. He could play off-ball linebacker for you. You've also got PJ Locke, who's not a linebacker, but if you're going to be playing a lot in the dime, if you're going to be playing a lot more in the nickel, do you start to think about how many positions can these guys play? Can we interchange players like PJ Locke or Baron Browning, different guys like that? Maybe even like we've mentioned before, Jonathan Cooper playing even a little bit of off-ball linebacker potentially. We don't know that for sure, but man, that's a possibility with his athleticism, right? So I think definitely there's options here. And the way the Broncos are constructed, and you teased that we're going to talk about it, they may not have, if they keep 4 linebackers on this roster, 4 off-ball linebackers, they may not have all 4 of those guys currently on the roster, because to me, outside of those top 3, you might be looking at more of practice squad type of guys, depending on what we see throughout training camp and preseason.
Which isn't a bad thing, too, especially for guys like Kanai Maga and Kodofi Wright. I mean, the undrafted rookie free agents from this year, they could easily sit on the practice squad and develop, because from what I have been told, Kanai Maga is a player that has stood out to some Broncos coaches. Now, while I don't know if you can go into the season with all the other players they have, you mentioned all the NFL caliber players, the active roster caliber players that this team has. Can you really afford to bring one of those guys onto the active roster at this point in time? I mean, I think we're pretty much in agreement of the top 3. We know that, hey, starter wise, it's going to be Josey Jewell in either or. We talk about Jonas Griffith or Alex Singleton. Who is that 4th guy? Like, if they do carry 4, like Justin Cernat, you mentioned as a favorite there. He's going to be competing with Barrington Wade, who played a lot of special teams last year. Did get thrown to the fire defensively a little bit against that Cleveland Browns team. And unfortunately, he and the rest of that unit did struggle. The whole entire Broncos defense struggled against Cleveland. I don't want to just single out linebackers. The D-line was very atrocious in that game. But then outside of that, you have these young, unproven guys. And so for you, like, I know you're very forward thinking. You kind of view things from a roster construction standpoint. Are you personally comfortable going into the season with Josey Jewell, Jonas Griffith, Alex Singleton, Justin Cernat, and those being the only 4 guys? Like, what are some of your contingency plans? Which I like that you mentioned some other positions. Is that enough? And like, how much of this will be based on flexibility with personnel, as you mentioned?
Yeah, to me, I don't feel comfortable. I know we talked about in a previous episode strengths and weaknesses on this Broncos team, and I think right now it's easy because things seem to be going so well with, Russell Wilson as the quarterback, and the ownership group keeps on growing, and it feels like things are just good in Broncos country. We've mentioned it before, even just music being back at practices, it's changed the whole vibe with the team, so it's kind of been easier to ignore roster weaknesses. But I think to me, this is that one area where, remember last season, and we've talked about this before as well, but it bears mentioning again. It's worth talking about just the fact that war on attrition. The Broncos lost both of their top 2 starters last season. And then beyond that, they lost other guys and they had to rotate other guys in. You mentioned that Cleveland game. That was kind of the turning point where I think everybody was like, all right, we kind of need to like literally in season rebuild this group. You had the trade for Kenny Young. You had the pickup of Micah Kaiser off the Rams practice squad. You had Avery Williamson on and off the practice squad as well, a veteran player. You had all these different pieces coming in and out. Even Curtis Robinson, who played in that Cleveland game, who was on the practice squad beforehand getting called up, he was just outright let go. The Broncos didn't bring him back. I believe he's with the San Francisco 49ers now. So it's just a fascinating deal how you go into the season, you feel like, all right, we got maybe 6 or 7 linebackers that we feel comfortable with. all of a sudden, in the middle of the season, you're shifting things completely. You made the trade for Jonas Griffith before the season even started. You're swapping all these different things around, bringing new guys into the fold, having to have players that maybe know the defense, maybe don't, maybe just have, familiarity with certain concepts. It's a really interesting dilemma that the Broncos are in. And thankfully they have those already on roster contingency plans like Baron Browning, who, I mean, he seems a little bit like superfluous depth off the edge at this point until we see what their plans are for him. So he could, in my mind, that's your absolute fail safe to say one of the starters goes down, we're throwing Baron Browning back at off-ball linebacker. That seems like a pretty good contingency plan, break in case of emergency type of deal there. But to me, I don't feel comfortable with this group going into the season. I hope, beyond all hope, Josey Jewell and Jonas Griffith and Alex Singleton, those guys can stay healthy all season, because we've seen the Broncos get some abnormal luck at other position groups that you don't normally see guys stay healthy, like at running back. Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams played most of last year, and that just doesn't happen for every team in the NFL. Maybe you get some abnormal luck at linebacker this year with your guys staying healthy and the guys that you want out there playing every single snap and whatnot. And not every single snap, but you know what I mean. We're going to be in the nickel, see plenty of dime defense and everything, but as many snaps as you need them to play. That's what I'm saying. So I don't feel comfortable with the way the roster is right now, and that's going to lead us to, could there be some potential training camp acquisitions?
Oh, and that's an interesting look we'll take at some potential free agents right now that are available, veteran options that could boost the Broncos defense, maybe during training camp, if in fact injuries do occur. Here are some names that you can get to. We're going to get that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about something we have going on here at the Locked On Podcast Network on the NFL side of things. Which NFL stars move the betting lines the most? Well, starting July 18th on the Locked On NFL channel, Locked On gives you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers at BetOnline. It's available July 18th on the Locked On NFL podcast, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or on YouTube. How many Denver Broncos maybe move the line here when it comes to betting? Make sure you tune in to Locked On NFL on July 18th throughout the entire week to find out a little bit more. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day. As we dive a little bit deeper, we were talking about Sayre's discomfort with the level of depth at the off-ball linebacker position, with just some of the names and the inexperience that the Broncos have right now. And if an injury were to occur, how it would affect the entire defense and maybe even the outcome of some games for this team. Now that takes us to who are some potential free agents that are still available at this point in time that maybe the Broncos could take a look at if something were to happen, or if you need an extra body to come in and fulfill a veteran-led group at the linebacker position. Who are some names to watch? Sayre, start things off with us. Give us a name right now that is still available at the time of this recording, who is a free agent that can play the off-ball linebacker position, that can offer value to the Broncos if, in fact, something were to happen. Who's the first name?
Well, this is not only the name of the off-ball linebacker that I would sign, but I would say I would go so far, Cody, as to say, besides maybe like, the pipe dream of like Rob Gronkowski, lure him out of retirement. How cool would that be to see him? But this might be the number one free agent that I would choose to add to the Denver Broncos roster right now. And that would be Anthony Barr, the former first-round pick of the Minnesota Vikings. To me, this would set you up for just some great success at the linebacker position, no matter what happens throughout the season. You have a top two of Josey Jewell, and let's just say Jonas Griffith. My prediction to lead the team in tackles after what we saw and what we've talked about, he had 40 tackles in those final 4 games of the season. I would love to see those two guys be your starters going into the year, but how nice would it be to have backups? Alex Singleton backing up Josey Jewell, and then Anthony Barr coming in and being a backup to Jonas Griffith. That would allow you to keep Baron Browning at the edge, really to see that experiment through, to say, hey, we're gonna do this full time. We're not gonna try to pull him back. We're going to have him do this full time. That allows you to keep your plan in place, because right now, let's say an injury does happen to Jonas Griffith, you're going to be in a position where you have to add somebody anyway, because you can't go into the season with the guys that we've mentioned as your top depth at that spot. So to me, Anthony Barr has a lot of the qualities that you would look for in any sort of pickup at this point of the year. First and foremost, you have familiarity, right? George Paton with the Minnesota Vikings, when they selected him in the first round, he knows him very well. As a matter of fact, it's a crazy fact, if you ever need to use this for trivia, he and Anthony Barr attended the same high school, obviously not at the same time, but they also both attended UCLA. So they have some strong ties together there, obviously then with the Minnesota Vikings. So to me, Cody, he would be that number one guy that I would say stylistically, you talk about the length, the ability to create plays, have such great range and different things that you can do, rushing the passer, playing the run, doing all these things at the off-ball linebacker position. I feel like Anthony Barr has proven that he can do all those things. So he would be easily my number one potential pickup for the Denver Broncos if they do add a free agent at the linebacker position.
It would make a lot of sense. And kind of connecting the dots to us, think about this next player, someone who we really like, Quan Alexander, who spent time with the New Orleans Saints more recently and also overcame an Achilles injury, but he also is a former San Francisco 49er. Now, Quan Alexander would be a great addition to come in, and maybe like if something were to happen to Josey Jewell, he would be the perfect backup linebacker right now, especially considering how statured he is as a veteran. Maybe some teams don't view him necessarily as a starter. I know that there are many teams out there that may view him as a starter, but I feel like in Denver right now, he would not come in and be a starter unless there was an injury. So if something were to happen with Josey Jewell, I feel like Quan Alexander would be a great insurance policy to have. He's one of those other names, but there's also another name to take a look at as well on this list that used to be a former Cleveland Brown, if I'm not mistaken, a former Pittsburgh Steeler that maybe the Broncos could inquire about. They had previous interest in him at one point in time. Who is it, Sayre?
Yeah, Joe Schobert, he's kind of been bouncing around the league. I think that's been surprising to a lot of people, right? Remember when the Broncos potentially had interest in him? He, like many other free agents, went and signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, no worries about that. I mean, obviously things didn't work out for him in Jacksonville and he was traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers and now he's a free agent. So, obviously there have been better days for Joe Schobert as an NFL player. But interestingly enough, he's still putting up numbers. He's still able to go out there and play a lot of games for you. Obviously, you look at his stats, you look at his numbers, Cody. The one thing that sticks out to me, very, very little missed time. I mean, he's always available, which is something that you really need at this position. And it's not like you can bank on that on a year-to-year basis. Injuries can happen to anybody at any time. But the fact that he does have a history of consistent durability, at least from what I was looking at, it looks like he could be an interesting pickup from that regard. And then you've got somebody that's been playing for the enemy, the Kansas City Chiefs, over the last handful of years that we've got to see plenty of this guy play. He seemed to play some pretty good games against the Denver Broncos as well. And also a former Iowa Hawkeye, Cody. So he plays to the old heartstrings here.
Oh, Anthony Hitchens is the guy that you're mentioning, and I don't think a lot of Broncos players like Anthony Hitchens, at least on the offensive side of the ball, specifically Quinn Miners. Remember there was a time Anthony Hitchens like threw a punch at Quinn Miners, and no one did anything about it. Like we saw it on the broadcast, like he just threw a punch at him. Nothing happened about that. But I think if you ask a lot of Kansas City Chiefs fans, they had a lot of dislike for Anthony Hitchens after I think the first couple of years there, which is why like Nick Bolton came in and took over for them. They drafted a guy in this year's NFL draft at the linebacker position. So Anthony Hitchens, I think, will give you maybe a little bit of a scheme advantage, like when you're going into a meeting, like if you're getting ready to play the Kansas City Chiefs, which wouldn't be towards probably the end of the season there for the Broncos. Looking at that, you could get some good intel there. He'd be more so probably a will linebacker. So if something were to happen to Jonas Griffith, he may be the option there. Those are some names to watch that are current free agents right here. Broncos country, would you be interested in any of the names that we mentioned down below? And how comfortable are you with the Broncos off-ball linebacker group ahead of the 2022 NFL season? Make sure you drop your comments and your thoughts down below in the YouTube comment section. Don't forget to join us here every single day for the Locked On Broncos podcast, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format. Not to mention, we have you covered here on YouTube as well. Tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos, we take a look at the quarterback position. Is there any quarterback controversy for the Broncos heading into training camp? Not so fast. We talk about the impact of Russell Wilson. We also talk about who backs up Russell Wilson and what is the outlook on how many quarterbacks the Broncos will carry on the active roster next season. You get that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.